Welcome back. This is session 3 of Unit 10, our last session on Chapter 11, where we cover basic cost management concepts, including cost allocation. In general, there are two methods for allocating indirect cost. By that we mean salaries of supervisors, rent on equipment, depreciation on facilities. There's the first method, which is referred to as the traditional cost allocation method. And then there's the more recent method, which is based on activities and referred to as activity-based cost allocation. We'll begin with the traditional method. In this slide, we can ignore the right-hand side of the slide labeled all unallocated value chain cost, $100,000. This refers to costs that occur before and after production. So it may include research and design cost. It may include distribution cost. It may include customer support cost. But these are not part of production and therefore are not allocated to production, or they do not become product cost. So we're focused on production cost. At the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see two products. One is pen casings and the other is cell phone casings. Both of these products have direct costs. They have direct materials and direct labor. You can see the dollar amounts for each of those. What we're concerned about here is allocating the indirect cost. As I mentioned earlier, salaries of production supervisors, rent on machinery, depreciation of facilities. Historically, traditionally, all of those indirect costs were thrown into one cost pool, and then a driver was identified for allocating those costs. In this case, they're using direct labor hours. And the idea is that, the products that use more direct labor hours will be assigned more of the indirect cost. Products that use fewer direct labor hours would be assigned less of the indirect cost, which is a fine concept. The problem we run into is that not all of the indirect costs are really associated with labor hours. Certainly, salaries of supervisors, we can see how that ties to direct labor hours. So allocating supervisor salaries based on labor hours makes sense. But those other indirect costs, such as rent and depreciation, hard to see how that relates to labor hours, and it's hard to make a case for allocating those costs, those indirect costs, based on labor hours. Nonetheless, using the traditional method, this company uses direct labor hours. 4,500 hours were spent on pen casings, 500 hours spent on cell phone casings, total of 5,000 labor hours. Of those 5,000 hours, 4,500 or 90% were attributed to labor spent on pen casings. Therefore, 90% of the overhead, 90% of $220,000 would be assigned to pen casings, or $198,000. The remaining labor hours were spent on cell phone casings, so 500 out of 5,000 is only 10%. Therefore, 10% of the overhead costs, or $22,000, would be assigned to cell phone casings. The issue we have in front of us is, have we really distributed indirect costs in a manner that reflects products' consumption of those resources? And we argue that activity-based costing comes closer to obtaining that goal. Okay, so here's the outline for activity-based costing. We begin at the top. This diagram shows only two cost categories: plant and machinery, engineers, and the equipment they use. We could have many other cost categories. And we proceed in two steps. In the first step, we assign each cost item to a cost pool. Here we're showing two cost pools: processing activity, production support activity. Processing activity is the actual the actual activities involved in processing a product, taking raw materials, direct labor, turning it into a final product. Production support activities are activities that take place in and around the production environment. They support the production of the items, but are not directly part of the process. Looking at plant and machinery expense, or plant and machinery costs, this company did an engineering analysis and identified that 75% of usage of the plant machinery was associated with the actual processing of materials and labor, the actual production of these casings. On the other hand, only 25% of the plant machinery was related to supporting the production of those products. So we see plant machinery costs being split 75 and 25%. On the other hand, engineers and their equipment, most of their time was spent on production support activities. So this has to do with tinkering with the designs that are used in producing pen casings, tinkering with the designs used in cell phone casings. That's 80% of their time. Therefore, 80% of the cost is assigned to the production support activity. 20% of the engineer's time is spent actually involved in the processing of products. And so we see 20% of that cost assigned to the processing activity. Now, to clarify, we could have some cost, indirect costs, that are assigned to one and only one activity, and we would certainly have many other costs. On the other hand, it's reasonable to even to have two or more cost pools under activity-based costing. We are moving away from having a single overhead cost pool to at least two or three smaller cost pools, but we certainly could have 4 or 5, depending on the number of unique activities identified. Now, the cost assigned to the cost pools are then allocated to the product lines. On the next screen, we'll look at the details, but essentially what we have here is the processing activity cost are going to be allocated using the cost driver the company was previously using, direct labor hours. So we know that 90% is going to be attributed to pen casings and only 10% attributed to cell phone casings. On the next slide, we'll see the allocation of product support cost. All right, here's my summary comparing the traditional method for allocating indirect costs to the ABC method. Just real quickly, under the traditional method, we assign 90% of the indirect cost, or $198,000, to pen casing, and only 10%, or $22,000, to cell phone casings. Under ABC, we had two separate activity pools. The first one, process activity cost, used the same cost driver we were using, direct labor hours. So 90% of those costs, or $128,700, were assigned to pen casings. Only 10%, or $14,300, assigned to cell phone casings. What is new is at the bottom of the slide, the allocation of production support activity cost. This allocation, taken right from your book, is based on number of distinct parts. Essentially, pen casings had 5 unique parts. Cell phone casings had 20 unique parts. A total of 25 unique parts. Okay, given that pen casings had only 5 of the 25, that's 20%. That product line is going to get 20% of the production support activity cost, whereas cell phone casings had 20 of the 25 distinct parts, or 80%. Therefore, cell phone casings will get 80% of the production support activity cost. So you can see the 20%, or $15,400, assigned to pen casings, 80%, or $61,600, assigned to cell phone casings. Now notice the totals. Under activity-based costing, pin casings were assigned 144,100 total indirect costs versus a much higher number under the traditional method, 198,000. Management accountants would say, well, under the traditional method, we were over allocating indirect costs to pin casings. Therefore, the product line was overcosted under the traditional method. Looking at cell phone casings, the total allocation and indirect costs is 75,900 compared to, under the traditional method, a much lower number, 22,000. So we would say, yes, the traditional method had undercosted cell phone casings, and in fact, the true consumption of resources is much higher. Cell phone casings under ABC had an allocation of 75,900. One of the implications here is that it'd be reasonable to tell management that, well, using a more sophisticated allocation of indirect cost, we see that cell phone casings are consuming more of our resources. We probably should raise the price on cell phone casings. On the other hand, pin casings are actually consuming less resources than we thought. We might want to lower the price of pin casings. That concludes ABC versus the traditional method of allocating indirect cost.